The moment Ivy crossed the threshold into Liam's space, she no longer resembled the composed, calculating figure she had so carefully maintained in recent weeks, but instead someone unraveling under the weight of a truth she could no longer contain, her composure fractured by urgency. Her voice strained not by performance, but by genuine fear. It was not simply the act of seeking him out that revealed the depth of her distress, but the way she carried herself, as though every second mattered, as though the walls around her were closing in and she had chosen him not out of convenience, but out of a last, desperate instinct to find someone who might still anchor her to reality before everything slipped beyond her control. Liam, accustomed to crisis but not to this particular intensity from Ivy, sensed immediately that this was not a casual request, not a moment of fleeting panic, but something deeper, something rooted in a situation that had already begun to spiral. Her plea came quickly, almost before she had fully settled into the space. A request not for help in the conventional sense, but for silence, for protection through omission, for a promise that what she was about to reveal would not be allowed to spread beyond the boundaries of their conversation. It was a strange request, not because secrecy itself was unusual, but because of the way she framed it, not as a strategic necessity, but as a condition for survival, as though the mere act of speaking carried risk, as though the truth she held was not just dangerous, but explosive. Liam listened, not interrupting, allowing her to release what she had been holding back. But even as he did, something within him began to shift, a quiet awareness that the nature of what she was asking did not align with the level of fear she was displaying. When she finally spoke of Will, of a plan that had already been set into motion, her words came in fragments, incomplete but suggestive, outlining just enough to establish that manipulation had been involved, that events surrounding Will had not unfolded as naturally as they appeared. At first, Liam's reaction was one of concern, not suspicion, because the idea that Ivy might have been involved in influencing Will's actions was troubling, but not entirely beyond the realm of what he could understand given the tensions that had been building. Yet as she continued, as the details began to accumulate, the tone of his understanding shifted, because what she was describing did not feel contained, did not feel like a single miscalculation or a moment of poor judgment, but part of something more structured, more deliberate, more dangerous than she was willing to fully admit. It was not a single inconsistency that triggered his doubt, but a pattern, a subtle misalignment between what she said and how she said it, between the scope of her confession and the depth of her fear. Liam had learned, through experience and instinct, that people reveal more in what they avoid than in what they express, and Ivy's hesitation, her careful selection of words, her refusal to fully articulate certain connections, began to stand out more than the information she was offering. He did not confront her immediately, because confrontation would have closed her off, would have pushed her further into defensiveness, and instead he allowed the conversation to unfold, guiding it gently, asking questions that seemed neutral but were designed to test the boundaries of what she was willing to reveal. As he did, the realization began to take shape, slow at first, then with increasing clarity, that Ivy was not simply asking him to conceal a past action, but to participate, however indirectly, in the continuation of something ongoing, something that had not yet reached its conclusion. The manipulation of Will, as serious as it was, now appeared to be only one piece of a larger sequence, a thread within a web of actions that extended beyond a single target, beyond a single objective. The more he listened, the more he understood that Ivy was standing at a crossroads, not just morally, but strategically, caught between the possibility of exposure and the momentum of what she had already set in motion. For Ivy, the pressure of that realization was becoming unbearable because she could feel Liam's perception shifting, could sense the moment when concern began to transform into suspicion, and that shift threatened everything she had come to him to protect. She had hoped that by revealing just enough, by framing the situation as a contained mistake, she could secure his silence, could enlist him as a quiet ally, without forcing him to confront the full reality of her actions. But Liam was not someone who could be easily guided into partial understanding. and the more he saw, the less he was willing to accept without clarity. The tension between them grew not through raised voices, but through the widening gap between what Ivy was willing to say and what Liam was beginning to see. His questions became more pointed, though still controlled, his tone shifting from passive listener to active observer, someone no longer absorbing information, but analyzing it. He began to connect pieces she had not explicitly linked, to draw conclusions she had tried to avoid, and in doing so, he forced her into a position she had been trying to escape, one where silence was no longer sustainable, where omission was no longer enough to maintain control. Ivy's internal conflict intensified in response, not because she did not understand what was required of her, but because she did, and that understanding made the choice before her far more difficult. To confess fully would mean dismantling the structure she had built, exposing not only her involvement, but the broader network of actions that connected her to others, actions that could not be undone, only confronted. It would mean relinquishing control, accepting consequences, and trusting that the truth, once revealed, would not destroy everything she had been trying to protect. But to continue the deception, to maintain the narrative she had constructed, would require deeper entanglement, more lies, more manipulation, and the risk that when the truth eventually emerged, it would do so with greater force, greater damage, greater finality. Liam, watching her struggle, recognized the weight of that decision, but he also understood that the longer she delayed, the narrower her options would become. He did not offer her an ultimatum, not directly, but his presence, his refusal to accept partial truth, created one nonetheless, because it forced her to confront the reality that she could not move forward without choosing a direction. His role in that moment was not to judge, but to hold the space where the truth could emerge, to remain steady even as the tension escalated, to resist the impulse to resolve the situation quickly in favor of allowing it to unfold with the clarity it required. The silence that followed was not empty, but filled with the weight of everything that had not yet been said, a pause that stretched between them as Ivy stood on the edge of a decision that would redefine not only her relationship with Liam, but her position within the larger conflict she had become part of. Her fear had not diminished, but it had changed, shifting from the fear of exposure to the fear of consequence, of what the truth would bring once it was no longer contained. In that moment, the path forward remained uncertain, suspended between two possibilities that could not coexist, each demanding a different version of herself, a different acceptance of responsibility, a different willingness to face the reality she had helped create. And as Liam waited, not for an answer, but for honesty, the tension between them became the focal point of a larger story, one where individual choices carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate, where the line between protection and complicity blurred, and where the truth, once released, would not simply resolve the conflict, but transform it into something far more complex, far more difficult to contain. The silence between Ivy and Liam did not break cleanly, nor did it resolve into a moment of clarity, but instead stretched into something heavier, more suffocating, as if the truth itself resisted being spoken, as if every second that passed made the weight of it harder to release. Ivy felt it pressing against her chest, that growing certainty that she had already waited too long, that every hesitation had narrowed her path until now there were only two directions left, neither of which offered safety. Her instinct was still to protect herself, to maintain control over the narrative she had so carefully shaped, but Liam's presence made that increasingly impossible, because he was no longer listening for reassurance, he was listening for truth, and she could see it in the way he watched her. Not with anger, not yet, but with a quiet determination that stripped away the illusion she had tried to preserve. When she finally spoke again, her words came slower, less controlled, as if she were stepping into something she could not fully manage once it began. The admission was not immediate or complete, but shifted the foundation of everything she had said before, revealing that what she had framed as a single manipulation involving what was only the surface of something deeper, something more structured and far more dangerous. She spoke of influence, of calculated timing, of moments that had been orchestrated rather than spontaneous. But even then, she hesitated at the edges of a larger truth, the part that connected her actions to others, the part that would expose the full extent of what had been set in motion. Liam did not interrupt, but the shift in his understanding was immediate and unmistakable. What had once been concern now hardened into something more focused, more analytical, as he began to see the pattern emerging beneath her fragmented explanation. This was not about Will alone, not about a single relationship manipulated for emotional gain, but about a chain of events that extended beyond one person, one outcome, into something that carried intention, structure, and consequence. He began to connect it to what he had already observed in recent weeks: the tensions within the family, the instability surrounding Taylor, the subtle but persistent sense that something unseen was guiding events from the background. The realization unsettled him, not just because of what it implied about Ivy, but because of what it suggested about the situation as a whole. If she was involved at this level, if she was connected to something larger, then the stakes were far greater than he had initially assumed, and the consequences of remaining silent would extend far beyond his own moral conflict. He was no longer being asked to protect a secret, but to ignore a threat, one that could impact people he cared about in ways he could not yet fully measure. Ivy saw the shift in him, felt it as a tightening of distance that no words could easily bridge. The space between them, once defined by urgency and shared tension, now carried a different weight, one of judgment, of consequence, of the realization that she had crossed a line that could not be undone. And yet, even in that moment, she hesitated to fully surrender the truth, because doing so would mean not only exposing herself, but implicating others, triggering a chain reaction she could not control. Her fear was no longer just about being discovered, but about what would happen when everything unraveled, when the structure she had been part of collapsed under the weight of its own deception. Outside that room, the consequences of her hesitation were already beginning to take shape. The tension surrounding Taylor had escalated, her condition becoming more unstable, more unpredictable, as forces she did not fully understand continued to move around her. Sheila's influence, though still hidden, had begun to intensify, her actions becoming more deliberate, more focused, as she sensed the narrowing window of opportunity. The hospital, once a place of recovery, had become something far more dangerous, a space where vulnerability was being exploited, where trust was being manipulated, and where time itself had become a factor that could not be ignored. At the same time, Dylan's position had grown increasingly precarious. The pressure to act, to eliminate the risk posed by Ivy, had begun to override the caution she had maintained, pushing her toward decisions that carried greater risk, greater visibility. She could feel the structure tightening around her, could sense that someone was beginning to understand more than they should, and that awareness accelerated her timeline, forcing her to consider actions she had previously delayed. The balance she had maintained between control and concealment was beginning to shift, and with it, the margin for error was shrinking. Back in the room, Liam's patience reached its limit, not in anger, but in clarity. He understood now that there was no version of the situation in which he could remain neutral, no position that allowed him to step back without becoming complicit. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried a firmness that had not been there before, a quiet but undeniable line being drawn, not as an ultimatum, but as a boundary. He did not demand everything at once, but he made it clear that partial truth was no longer enough, that whatever Ivy was holding back was no longer just her burden to carry, but something that affected others, something that required action. The pressure of that moment forced Ivy into the decision she had been avoiding. The fear of exposure, the instinct to protect herself, collided with the realization that silence would no longer protect anyone, least of all her. The truth, once released, would not simply resolve the situation, but it would shift it, redirect it, create consequences that would extend beyond anything she could predict. And yet, The alternative, continuing the deception, now felt even more dangerous because it meant allowing events to unfold without intervention, without resistance, without the possibility of altering the outcome. When she finally crossed that threshold, when she allowed the truth to emerge in full, it did not come as a dramatic confession, but as a steady, deliberate release of everything she had been holding back. The connections, the coordination, the roles played by others, the intent behind actions that had once seemed isolated, all of it unfolded in a way that left no room for reinterpretation. Liam listened, absorbing not just the information, but the implications, the way each piece fit into a larger structure that was now impossible to ignore. The moment the truth was fully spoken, the dynamic between them shifted again, not back to what it had been, but into something new, something defined by urgency rather than uncertainty. There was no longer time for hesitation, no space for internal conflict, because the situation had moved beyond personal consequence into immediate danger. Taylor needed protection. Ivy needed to be secured. Dylan needed to be stopped. And Sheila, still operating from the shadows, needed to be exposed before her plan reached its final stage. What had begun as a private confrontation between two people had now expanded into something far larger, a convergence of hidden agendas, long-standing grudges, and carefully orchestrated actions that were finally being brought into the light. The race that followed was not just against time, but against momentum, against a sequence of events that had already been set in motion and would not easily be undone. And as Liam stepped into that reality, no longer as an observer, but as an active participant, the weight of what lay ahead became clear, because this was no longer about uncovering the truth, but about surviving it, about navigating the consequences of its release, and about determining whether. In the end, the truth